I was a college student when the original Star Wars movie was released, and this week, the 9th episode of the series has completed the 9-movie run with The Rise of Skywalker, featuring, ironically, the 3 main characters from the original movie, aged by 43 years, and in spite of the fact that one of them's actually been dead for 3 years now. But they've all been a part of my life. I've loved them. I had the movie posters in my grad school office. I've enjoyed all of them in spite of the fact that some of them were obviously better than others. They express, as only computer-generated special effects can, that eternal battle between good and evil, with all the values of heroism, of sacrifice, and at moments even hints of fairly profound theology. However, what these movies are not is historical. Even though in the very same movie theater where I saw The Rise of Skywalker, the day before I had watched Dark Waters, a historical documentary about the environmental pollution history of DuPont in West Virginia. But no one had to tell me that one was historical and one was fictional. Side by side, in the same historical time frame, in the same building, we inherently understand that there are genres of literature. Some tell a story mythically, some tell a story as factually as possible. We can go, all of us, to Parkersburg, West Virginia, and meet some of the characters portrayed in Dark Waters. They still live there. They are still being impacted by the chain carbon molecules that were dumped into their water and their air. You cannot, however, go to Skywalker Ranch in California and go for a flight into space on the Millennium Falcon. I believe that even the news staff of Fox News could tell the difference between the two, though I am also reasonably certain that they could find some way to mess up even this illustration. We began this morning with Ashley's excellent reading of Bishop Spong's commentary on the birth narratives in the New Testament. But John Spong was far from being the first person to state clearly that the birth narratives are not history. They're actually more along the lines of a Star Wars narrative, because they are stories about the battle between good and evil, between light and darkness, the good side of the Force and the bad side. And while I do not consider myself to be an original scholar by any stretch of the imagination, I didn't have to be told that the birth narratives were not historical. In fact, I remember raising the issue with my New Testament professor when I was just 19 years old, asking him in a fairly conservative religious environment that shocked my overly religiously zealous students sitting all around me. But I just said, Professor Dudry, these stories don't even use the same vocabulary as the rest of the Gospels. They describe the events in clearly mythological ways. It doesn't make any sense to me that they're even attached to the Gospels. They seem clearly to be fiction. The students around me were shocked, offended, but even in that conservative religious college, the professor quickly acknowledged that I was absolutely right, that they're not historical. They were never intended to be read as history. The original authors were not trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. They were just telling a story. This is one of the dirty little secrets that even right-wing Bible scholars know, but are often afraid to say in public. The fact that Star Wars does not describe actual historical events will not keep me from seeing even this last episode several times before it leaves the theaters, nor does it take away from the truths about the character and faith that is portrayed in the movies. The first Christians who produced the Christmas story late in the 1st century or early in the 2nd century did not think that they were writing history. They were basically preaching a sermon. It was a theological story. 200 years later, in the confusion of the era, Constantine's mother, Saint Helena, took the Gospels quite literally, and she did go back to Israel and tried to identify the places where these events had allegedly taken place, and built huge cathedrals in Bethlehem and in Jerusalem. But let's be honest. Helena was a woman of great faith. Her son, Constantine, was a calculating politician who simply used his mother's religion to reunite the four divided parts of the Roman Empire. But neither Constantine nor Helena had the slightest clue about the actual historical circumstances surrounding the birth of Jesus. For that matter, whoever wrote the birth narratives in Matthew and Luke also either didn't know or didn't care about any of the historical details of Jesus' birth. They were not newspaper reporters, assuming that newspaper reporters care about facts. They were preachers, and they had a perspective to sell to their audience. I don't want to dwell too long on this, but just let me say quickly for the uninitiated that of the four Gospels of the New Testament, Mark and John have nothing to say about the birth of Jesus, and Matthew and Luke offer broadly diverging stories. Both of them have Mary, Joseph, and Jesus. They agree on the gender and the name of the child and the city where the child was born, and that's where agreement ends. It took 1,000 years after these Gospels were put together for anyone to put a creche that had the wise men and the shepherds standing side by side. The shepherds are in Luke, the Magi are in Matthew. In Matthew, they live in Bethlehem and they've got a house there. In Luke, they travel there for a made-up census and stay in a barn, basically. They cook up a reason that they had to go to Bethlehem after the miraculous birth was heralded by angels and the child was adored by farmhands. They went back to Nazareth. It's worth noting that Matthew's version rather misogynistically gives the visions and the speaking parts only to men. Women don't speak in Matthew. Luke is much more inclusive and gives major parts to the women who gave birth to John the Baptist and to Jesus, relegating the men to supportive roles, which I trust we can all agree now that when you're talking about a birth, the girls have a bigger role. And the guys could just kind of fade into the background. But once you accept that Matthew and Luke are not trying to record eyewitness accounts, then we are free to ask, what was their point? If they're not trying to tell us how it actually happened, what are they trying to tell us? Now, both writers were influenced by Jewish tradition, much more so by Greek culture in which they lived. Predictably, then, both accounts contain a certain amount of homage to their cultural setting. Because of popular Jewish beliefs at the time, they needed to place the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem, even though that's probably not factual. And for that matter, Nazareth, we have no record of there being a village named Nazareth until after the New Testament was written, probably a play on the Nazarites of Samson fame, but the Gospels were written by Greek-speaking people that didn't live in Israel, so they didn't really know that much about it. So, Bethlehem was a claim that they needed to make to satisfy their Jewish audiences, but like Caesars and renowned philosophers, they also needed to give him a virgin birth, and as they did with other famous people in the time, a star was said to have appeared in the sky at the time of his birth. In ancient literature, we call these ascriptions of praise. They're not intended to be taken literally. They are flourishes in which a writer is able to heap praise on a particularly important historical character. But even in the first century, if anyone hears that someone had a virgin birth. Well, most of us that grew up around farms, we kind of know how this stuff works. And that just wasn't a story that anybody was going to buy. Other elements of their stories also have historical or biblical precedent. The songs of Mary and Elizabeth hearken back to the song of Hannah around the birth of Samuel. And the slaughter of the innocents reflects the murder of infants in Exodus in the time of Moses. While all of these elements have their literary genesis, you have to be careful to note that none of them are chosen haphazardly. Matthew and Luke are not just piling on. They are creating a sermonic narrative. Consider the way that Matthew uses the common image of the appearance of a new star and even the common religious element of men having visions to set up this narrative so that he can pull in these foreign astrologers, a religion that was condemned in Israel, in order to kind of throw it up in the face of both the government and the state religion. Matthew doesn't just have a star, he's letting you know what disdain he feels for the government of Israel, for Rome, and for the Jewish state. The arrival of the holy birth was not only unknown to the government, it was unknown to the biblical scholars. It's kind of like saying the faculty at Harvard Divinity School didn't have a clue about what was going on, but the palm reader sitting on a sidewalk stool had all the facts. The author of this narrative is intentionally being dismissive of both organized religion and the state to dramatically underscore how far apart the message of Jesus was from either the state religion or the government. They colluded together to kill Jesus in the crib before he gets a chance to grow up. Now, this slaughter of the innocents under Herod in Bethlehem leaves no historical clues, which is to say it didn't happen. But it isn't about history. It's about telling a story that reveals the truth. Consider this 19th century painting by the French artist Léon Cogniet. Unlike many who portray such graphic biblical scenes in full bloody horror, he pulls the narrative down so that we look only into the face of this horrified woman. All of the action is far in the background and unclear. He wants us to see that mother's face, who is cradling her baby, and she stares back at us in shock and horror as if she is demanding an answer from us. How could this be happening? How could the city elders allow this? Why would the government do this? Where is the church? Where are the good people, the powerful, the wealthy, the influential? How did the whole world go violently mad? There's your Christmas story. Matthew is telling us about a horror, which was not a single historical event, but a global and daily experience of horror, of insanity, of madness. Not cattle lowing and a baby laying in sweet-smelling hay in a manger. That's the Christmas at the Battlefield Mall. Don't mix that up with the theological story. The real story is this, because this is our Christmas. The slaughter of the innocents in Bethlehem in the first year of the Common Era didn't actually happen, but let me tell you, folks, this crap happens every day. This isn't about one incident, and it isn't about one child. In 2019, our government has put 70,000 children into dog cages. Many permanently separated from their parents. They didn't even keep good records. Many of the parents have been deported, and the children are just left indefinitely in detention. Some of whom have died lying on concrete floors, and they have died under such stupid circumstances as dehydration or the flu. Many have been put into foster care where they have been sexually molested or otherwise abused, all on government orders. Or did you think Herod was dead? paid for with taxpayers' money, and largely condoned by the silence of the church, the synagogue, and the mosque. So where are the statesmen? Where are the wise men? Where are the pastors? Where are the prophets, the senators, and the kings of our corporate world? Matthew doesn't tell us about an event that happened once in a galaxy far, far away, long, long ago. He's telling you what's happening in your country right now. Luke doesn't use the same literal images, but he tells a story in a very similar way that ends up with the same moral. The church gives us a Madonna and child that on the one hand, now try to hear this, praises virginity and motherhood in the same breath. That takes a theologian to cook up that paradox. But that is not the picture that Luke paints for us. He has a pregnant girl living in an occupied country under the constant fear of death and rape and starvation, and she stands up and she sings a song about revolution. He has shown his might with the strength of his arm. He's scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. He has brought down the powerful from their thrones, lifted up the lowly. He's filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. And you can almost hear the chorus of religious people saying, well, you'll never pass that agenda. You got to be more moderate. You got to go to the middle of the road. You can't marry. You can't win singing that song. You got to sing a song about how everything has to stay virtually the same, just make it a little kinder. But Mary says, oh, you rich people are about to go on a diet you're not going to enjoy. Honestly, the picture Luke paints is more of a Jedi warrior than it is a teenage virgin mother. If you're going to create a fictional female lead, a defiant revolutionary who wants to cast down evil lords and give the hungry something to eat, I think is a much better image, much more believable than a teenage virgin mother. I realize that this is not the Christmas sermon that will be delivered this week at the Vatican, and it won't be delivered at the National Cathedral. But I'm being very honest here. This is the Christmas sermon you would find in the New Testament, where the God-child is born in a smelly barn in a world with a corrupt government and a nearly useless church. And a terrorized mother clutches her child who's about to be taken from her and asks us what we are going to do about how this world has gone mad. Obviously, when I talk about a Savior, I don't mean the same thing as most religious people mean. I don't think I particularly need to be saved from hell, and I suspect most of you don't either. I don't need to be forgiven for my lack of piety or purity. What I need to be forgiven for is every day that I have been complacent about the cruelty and insanity of my government that still has 70,000 children in cages, and the uselessness of the institutional church where I spent way too much of my life. We need to quit waiting for a Savior and become saviors. So Merry Christmas.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.